Blackwood House stood at the edge of the dense whispering woods, an imposing Victorian mansion with a dark past. For decades, it had been abandoned, its windows boarded up and its paint peeling away in long, ghostly strips. The locals avoided it, speaking in hushed tones about the gruesome murders that had taken place within its walls. They said the house was cursed, haunted by the restless spirits of those who had died there. In the fall of 1985, the Thompson family moved into Blackwood House. John and Sarah Thompson, along with their teenage daughter Emily, were unaware of the house's sinister history. They were looking for a fresh start after a series of financial troubles, and the mansion's surprisingly low price seemed like a blessing. The first few days were uneventful. The Thompsons busied themselves with unpacking and settling into their new home. Emily, a quiet and introverted girl, spent most of her time exploring the house. She was fascinated by its old-world charm, with its grand staircase, ornate fireplaces, and dusty, forgotten rooms. One afternoon, while rummaging through the attic, Emily found an old leather-bound journal. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with the scribbled entries of a man named Dr. Henry Blackwood, the house's original owner. Dr. Blackwood had been a respected surgeon in the late 1800s, but his journal revealed a darker side. The entries began innocuously enough, describing his daily life and medical practices. But as Emily read on, the tone grew increasingly disturbing. Dr. Blackwood wrote about his fascination with the human body, his desire to push the boundaries of medical science. He began conducting experiments on unwilling subjects, vagrants and orphans he had lured to the house with promises of food and shelter. The experiments were gruesome and fatal, their details described in horrific detail. Emily's hands shook as she turned the pages. The final entry was the most chilling. It detailed a ritual that Dr. Blackwood believed would grant him eternal life. The ritual required the blood of 7 innocent victims, and he had already taken 6. That night, Emily was plagued by nightmares. She saw visions of the victims, gaunt, hollow-eyed figures reaching out to her, their mouths open in silent screams. She woke up drenched in sweat, her heart pounding. The room was freezing, and she could see her breath in the air. She heard faint whispers, as if voices were echoing through the walls. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the house grew increasingly oppressive. Strange things began to happen. Doors slammed shut on their own, lights flickered, and the temperature would drop suddenly. John and Sarah dismissed these occurrences as the quirks of an old house, but Emily knew better. She could feel a malevolent presence watching her. One evening, while Sarah was preparing dinner, she heard a faint, melodic humming. She followed the sound to the basement, where she found an old phonograph. It started playing on its own, the haunting melody filling the air. As she turned to leave, she saw a shadowy figure standing at the top of the stairs. It vanished as quickly as it had appeared, but Sarah was left with an overwhelming sense of dread. Driven by a growing sense of urgency, Emily decided to investigate the basement. She found a hidden door behind a stack of old crates. It led to a small, windowless room with stone walls and a heavy iron door. Inside, she discovered a macabre scene. There were rusty surgical instruments, chains bolted to the walls, and dark stains on the floor, evidence of Dr. Blackwood's horrific experiments. In the center of the room was a stone altar, and above it, inscribed on the wall, was a series of cryptic symbols. Emily recognized them from the final entry in Dr. Blackwood's journal. They were part of the ritual. Her blood ran cold as she realized the truth. Dr. Blackwood's spirit was trapped in the house, and he needed one more victim to complete his ritual. That night, the house erupted in chaos. The whispers grew louder, becoming a cacophony of tormented screams. Shadows twisted and writhed along the walls, and the temperature plummeted. Emily could barely see through the thick fog of her breath. She knew she had to end the nightmare. Armed with Dr. Blackwood's journal, Emily made her way to the basement. She had to destroy the altar and the symbols that bound his spirit to the house. As she descended the stairs, she felt an icy hand grip her ankle. She screamed and kicked, breaking free just as a shadowy figure lunged at her. In the basement, Emily began to chant the words she had found in the journal, a counter-ritual meant to banish spirits. The shadows converged on her, their forms solidifying into grotesque, nightmarish shapes. The air grew thick with the smell of decay. Emily's voice trembled, but she kept chanting. The walls shook, and the altar cracked. A deafening roar filled the room as a blinding light erupted from the altar, enveloping everything in its path. Emily was thrown backward, hitting her head against the wall. Darkness consumed her. Emily woke up in a hospital bed, her parents by her side. The house had collapsed, leaving nothing but rubble. The fire department said it was a gas explosion, but Emily knew the truth. The spirits were gone, the curse lifted, and Dr. Blackwood's reign of terror had ended. The Thompsons moved away from Hollowbrook, seeking a new start far from the horrors of Blackwood House. Emily never spoke of what happened that night, but she carried the memories with her, a reminder of the darkness that once dwelled in their home. Years later, as Emily sat in her college dorm room, she often found herself thinking back to that fateful night. The memories haunted her dreams, but they also made her stronger. She had faced true horror and survived. Now, she was determined to help others, to ensure that no one else would ever have to endure what she had. Despite the destruction of Blackwood House, rumors of its haunting persisted. Locals whispered about strange sightings in the woods where the house once stood. A new legend began to form, one that said the land itself was cursed, and that Dr. Blackwood's spirit still lingered, waiting for a new vessel to complete his unholy ritual. Emily, now a young woman, had become a folklore researcher, driven by her past to uncover the truths behind ghost stories and urban legends. Her work took her to many haunted locations, but none had ever affected her as deeply as Blackwood House. One day, she received a call from a former classmate, Mark, who had stayed in Hollowbrook. He sounded frantic, claiming that something terrible was happening in the woods. People were disappearing again, and strange symbols were appearing on trees and rocks. Mark begged Emily to return, convinced that only she could help. Reluctantly, Emily agreed. She returned to Hollowbrook, feeling a mix of dread and determination. Mark met her at the edge of the woods, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. He led her to a clearing where the remains of Blackwood House still lay, now overgrown with weeds and vines. The air was thick with an unnatural chill, and Emily felt the same oppressive atmosphere she remembered from her childhood. Together, they ventured deeper into the woods, following the symbols that Mark had described. They came upon a circle of stones, each marked with the same cryptic symbols from Dr. Blackwood's journal. In the center of the circle was a large, flat rock, stained dark with what looked like fresh blood. Emily realized that someone was trying to replicate Blackwood's ritual. They had to stop it before another innocent life was taken. She remembered the counter-ritual she had used to destroy the altar years ago. It might be their only chance. As night fell, Emily and Mark gathered the necessary items for the counter-ritual. The woods grew eerily silent, and the temperature dropped sharply. Emily began to chant the words from the journal, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. The symbols on the stones began to glow with an unholy light, and shadows twisted around them, forming into ghastly apparitions. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness, a man dressed in tattered, blood-stained clothing. His eyes were empty sockets, and his mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. It was Dr. Blackwood, or what remained of him. His spirit had found a new host, and he was determined to complete the ritual. Emily continued to chant, even as Blackwood advanced towards her. Mark tried to hold him back, but the doctor was unnaturally strong. With a surge of adrenaline, Emily reached into her bag and pulled out a vial of holy water, throwing it at Blackwood. The liquid sizzled and smoked as it made contact, causing the spirit to recoil with a guttural scream. Summoning all her strength, Emily recited the final words of the counter-ritual. The ground beneath the stones trembled, and a blinding light erupted from the circle, enveloping Blackwood and the cursed symbols. The air was filled with the sounds of wailing spirits being torn from their earthly bonds. When the light faded, the woods were silent once more. The symbols had vanished, and the oppressive atmosphere had lifted. Emily and Mark stood in the clearing, shaken but alive. They knew that Dr. Blackwood's spirit had finally been banished, and the curse of Blackwood House was broken for good. Emily returned to her life, her work now focused on helping others confront and overcome the supernatural. She had faced her deepest fears and emerged victorious. The horrors of Blackwood House were behind her, but the lessons she had learned would stay with her forever. In Hollowbrook, the story of Emily Thompson became a legend of its own, a tale of courage and resilience in the face of unimaginable terror. And though the town would always remember the dark history of Blackwood House, they also remembered the girl who had freed them from its grip. The Haunted Diary. Lena sat in the backseat of the car, her headphones on, trying to drown out the world with music. The landscape outside the window blurred as they drove further away from the bustling city she had always known. Her family had decided to move to Hollowbrook, a quaint, sleepy town nestled in the countryside. Her father had accepted a job as the new town doctor, and her mother was eager for a change of pace. Lena, however, was less enthusiastic. Hollowbrook was a stark contrast to the city. It was small, with a population that could easily fit into a few apartment buildings back in her old neighborhood. The houses were old, with ivy creeping up the walls and paint peeling from the shutters. It was picturesque in a way, but also eerily quiet. As they pulled into the driveway of their new home, Lena felt a chill run down her spine. The house was large and Victorian, with a wraparound porch and a turret that looked like it belonged in a fairy tale or a ghost story. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her from one of the dark windows. The first week in Hollowbrook was uneventful. Lena spent most of her time unpacking and avoiding interactions with the locals. She was shy and found it difficult to make new friends. At school, she kept to herself, sitting in the back of the classroom and eating lunch alone. One afternoon, while exploring the attic of their new home, Lena stumbled upon an old, dusty trunk. Curiosity got the better of her, and she opened it to find a collection of old books and trinkets. Among them was a diary bound in worn leather. It looked ancient, the pages yellowed with age. Lena took the diary to her room and began to read. The entries were written in a spidery script, and the first few pages seemed normal enough, describing the mundane life of a girl named Eliza who had lived in Hollowbrook over a century ago. But as Lena read further, the tone of the diary changed. Eliza wrote about strange occurrences in the town, people disappearing without a trace. The townsfolk were baffled, and fear spread through Hollowbrook. The final entries in the diary were frantic, filled with fear and paranoia. Eliza wrote about seeing shadows moving in the night and hearing whispers in the walls. She believed the town was cursed, and the diary hinted at a malevolent presence that chose its victims seemingly at random. Lena felt a growing unease as she read, but she couldn't put the diary down. The last entry was the most disturbing. Eliza wrote that she had discovered a pattern to the disappearances. She didn't have time to explain it fully, but she mentioned that she knew who the next victim would be. The entry ended abruptly, with a dark stain obscuring the rest of the text. Over the next few days, Lena couldn't stop thinking about the diary. She began to notice that the townspeople were behaving strangely. They were overly cautious, and conversations would abruptly stop when she entered a room. One evening, while walking home from school, she saw posters on a notice board. Several people had recently gone missing. The dates matched the timeline in Eliza's diary. Lena decided to investigate further. She spent hours in the local library, poring over old newspapers and town records. She discovered that the disappearances had been happening for over a century, with the same frequency and eerie regularity. Every few months, someone would vanish without a trace, and the town would fall into a hushed silence, waiting for the next victim. One night, as Lena was reading the diary again, she noticed something she had missed before. There was a hidden compartment in the back cover. She pried it open to find a small, folded piece of paper. It was a list of names, dates next to each one. The most recent name was her neighbor, Mr. Thompson, who had disappeared the previous week. The next name on the list was someone she knew, Anna, a girl from her school who had tried to befriend her. Lena's heart pounded in her chest. She had to warn Anna. She ran to Anna's house, but when she arrived, she found it empty. The door was ajar, and there were signs of a struggle. Lena's blood ran cold. She was too late. Determined to uncover the truth, Lena delved deeper into the diary. She found references to an old legend about Hollowbrook. The town was built on land that was once home to a powerful witch. The townspeople had accused her of dark magic and had her executed. With her dying breath, she cursed the town, vowing that it would never be free of her wrath. She would take her revenge by claiming a life every few months. Lena realized that the diary itself was cursed, a tool the witch used to choose her victims. The names appeared magically, and once a name was written, that person was doomed. Lena's hands shook as she thought about the implications. If she could find a way to destroy the diary, perhaps she could break the curse. Lena gathered all the courage she could muster and decided to confront the dark force head-on. She went to the town's old cemetery, where Eliza had mentioned the witch was buried. Under the cover of night, Lena dug at the gravesite, finding an ancient, decrepit coffin. She opened it to find the witch's remains and the source of her power, a dark amulet. With the diary in one hand and the amulet in the other, Lena set them both on fire. The flames roared to life, and a horrifying scream echoed through the night. The ground trembled, and a gust of wind nearly knocked her off her feet. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the fire died out. The diary and the amulet were reduced to ashes. The next morning, Hollowbrook felt different. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, and the townspeople seemed lighter, more at ease. Lena's parents noticed the change in her too. She was more confident, more willing to engage with others. The disappearances stopped, and life in Hollowbrook returned to normal. Lena made new friends, including Anna, who had somehow been spared from the witch's curse. The town's dark history faded into legend, a story told to scare children on dark, stormy nights. Lena never forgot the diary or the witch's curse, but she was grateful for the chance to start anew. She had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, knowing that sometimes the quietest voices have the most to say. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Make sure to press the bell icon.